Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
This is September 3rd, 2020, and this is episode 88 of Transmission.
Woohoo.
Just like a symmetry to that.
Yes. Infinity.
Or,
sideways.
or is it just episode 8, but it's looking into a mirror?
Ooh.
For those who are maybe tuning in for the first time, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. Good morning, Kathleen.
Yeah, and so we're talking about violence and nonviolence and the left today, which...
All right, so this is part 3.
Part 3.
Our 3-part series. Yes. Part 3 of our 90-minute sermon, which has made Gus excited.
Yeah. So the first episode, we talked about what is the left, not in any comprehensive way, but because people throw that around. We wanted to have a clarification of terms. Yesterday, we talked about spirituality in the left. And this one connects a lot. This connects a lot with that spirituality piece. Because if there's anything, if you get it in a room with leftists, I mean, the people that read Marx without feeling like they're being transgressive about it, like, right, the people that are just, they want a different society, they want revolution, and you talk about nonviolence, instantly people will start getting heated and upset. It's like one of the core argument issues among leftists. And so hopefully we'll stir up hopefully we bring it out of people and people start just throwing angry comments at us. We're ready.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off by just talking about violence in general. Like, what is violence? And where does that come from?
Even that is such a contentious discussion to have.
Yes, it is. So Thomas Merton has a great quote about this. He talks about that human beings seem to have an innate proclivity towards violence. And certainly, if you're a biblical person and you look at kind of the first thing that happens after human beings wake up from their naked vegetarian stupor in the Garden of Eden, and the first thing that happens is an act of violence, right? The story of Cain and Abel, brothers killing each other, and so violence shows up in the human being pretty much across the boards, everywhere you go. And it seems that it's rooted in one, survival, right? So we even have this term, the fight or flight response. Or it's rooted in domination and control. And so I have a colleague who's an economist at the University of Maryland, and he talks about he wants to write this book that's like the economy of everything, the history of economics. And he likes to talk about the Don and John world. And so he posits, he talks about, like, imagine that there are only two people, Don and John, and they sort of try to control each other for resources and start fighting about this. And so, once somebody gets bigger and stronger and wants more stuff, they beat up on somebody else. So human beings kind of have these, and then of course the people who are trying to survive, right? They get into the fight or flight response, and they fight back.
I like that way of kind of delineating violence. I mean, there's so much more nuance and complexity, like what kind of society brings out more of the capacity for oppression. But to me, it's interesting. And a lot of these conversations around nonviolence come down to, and this is where a lot of pushback happens, people who are a part of a system where they personally don't have to kill anybody, relying upon complex systems of oppression and not seeing themselves as participating in violence, who then get upset when people who are in the other category of fighting for survival act up with violence and saying, step off, you shouldn't be violent. I'm going to go to TGI Fridays now and in my motor oil mobile and
Right.
act like I'm not participating in anything violent at
Right.
all.
Right. And so that's one of the things that more complex societies do, right? Is they farm out their violence. And of course, the whole concept of a mercenary, right? The concept of soldiers or armies, essentially what you're doing is you're paying somebody else to do your violence. So yeah, so if you're part of the in group that is part of the, peaceful little conclave that has been created within society, it's very easy for you to think, oh yeah, I'm not violent, until of course a protest comes along and you see chaos, and then you have, right now we're witnessing this massive sort of fight or flight response from the white majority system in this country, who suddenly are like, yeah, we need to suppress all these violent people with violence.
Yeah, it reminds me of Mennonites. I'm kind of a nominal Mennonite, I guess, at this point, who be like vehemently anti-war. Just there's no place for soldiering or war. It's bad. And then you ask them, what about the police? They're like, oh yeah, I love the police, and they don't see a disconnect, right? Because of
Yeah, and then
because of the categories we put, like police officers are good guys who defend and only use violence, maybe rarely if they need to, and then soldiers are just sent to kill, like as though that's the way reality works.
and then you also, so this is some of the social manifestations, but then we also need to look at, you have the family manifestations of violence, right? So patriarchy is a system based on violence where men oppress women, and then of course also oppressing queer people and anyone that doesn't fit into the binary notion of sexuality and gender. And so not only do you have social systems that support that violence, right? So it's legal to beat up your wife, it's legal to kill your wife, all kinds of things like that. But you also have a sort of social fabric that says, well, yeah, the man of the house can use violence to keep their family in line. And so violence as a means of control, which I would argue is also undergirded by violence in response to this fear of non-existence, right? So it's the two are connected. This is definitely endemic in human society. So then when, and I think that most people don't really spend enough time thinking about this, honestly, because if you immediately jump to just the question of violence and nonviolence within political discourse, you're not really looking very deeply at what is going on inside of each one of us, that we have this reaction to survive, that we will bring violence to that. And I think that's a very important thing to be aware of.
Well, and then also the, recently with these homeless encampments in Minneapolis, it's amazing how perspectives are so different in using and weaponizing the idea of violence, right? So when we talk about protests, oftentimes people will talk about violent protesters, even if no one physically gets harmed except for the protesters. The protesters are the violent ones because we imagine them being angry, and if a building gets burnt down, we equate that with violence. In some ways, in a way that gets more of a visceral response than if a protester got murdered, right? So there's this layer of thing. So like, who's the violent aggressor in this moment? Or with these homeless encampments, you know, bunch of people camping in an open space, stuff gets dicey, and so the neighbors will call them violent and unsafe, but then call the police in, who will literally bulldoze over tents and throw everything away and send people on the streets, and people won't see that as a violent act. So this idea of violence is, there's so many layers, the layers of how much you are constraining a person from being able to live into a fulfilled life, whether you physically harm them or not, the idea of bringing physical harm. And then there's these ideas of whether or not it seems intense. So intense things are often described as violent. And then whether you're talking about people, plants, objects. And so the word violent is a very inelegant word that tries to hold too much. And so everything breaks down and becomes polarized with violence and nonviolence. And when you tell someone who's committed to nonviolence that nonviolence can be used as a tool of oppression, they don't even know how to understand that.
Right. So Kathleen has a comment that was relevant to what we were talking about here.
My ex-husband formulated the coding for nuclear weapons. We had huge arguments about it. I saw it as supporting state violence. He countered by saying that every time we pay taxes, we participate in violence.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, and your ex is right. And so, yeah, I mean, every time we pay taxes, that is a way of us participating in the violence that the state does to keep the state the way that it is. And yeah, and that's true. And you know, Mark, as you were just saying, we who live in the state and are brought up, you know, with all the formation and the mythology and the grandeur of how great the state is, which is what every state does. I mean, this isn't particular to America. You know, every state always does this. You are normalized to that kind of violence, right? And so the greater reaction that you have is to activity that threatens that order and that equilibrium. And so that triggers our fight or flight response because we're being threatened. And so then we see that as this violent, aggressive act. The violence that keeps us normalized calms us because we're safe. And so we don't register that as violence.
well, so you get a classic historic example of a Black person going into a soda shop during segregation and sitting down. And in that sense, there was an equilibrium of whiteness in there. The Black person comes in and is uppity and disruptive. And so then their reaction, pouring a milkshake over their head, physically ejecting them, spitting on them, whatever, like these horrific things aren't seen as particularly violent because the violence came when that Black person came through the door. Like that's how it would have been perceived by people. Now we look at that differently and say, oh, they were exerting their regular rights. It's just, it depends on what you see as disruptive.
Yeah.
And so this is where people often like this idea that we have, and I think this is important to kind of, I've pointed out this before, that you have the middle, which is kind of peaceable, and then you have the left and the right, and if you get violent at the extremes. And so anytime someone is particularly disruptive, we think of it as violent, without realizing the mountain of bones that the moderate middle is built upon, the status quo is built upon. We're blind to our own complicity in violence, usually.
Yeah, and so that's where you know, so the left, which again is anti-monarchist, right? That's where it got started. So the left being, you know, anti-status quo and anti-oppression. Basically starts, all right, what are the strategies and tactics for revolution? Uh-oh, got a glitch there.
Yeah.
What are the strategies and tactics for revolution? How do we enact change? And then that's where, violence becomes this heated conversation relative to political strategy, right? And so you have some folks that are like, well, the state is unbelievably violent and oppressive. We need to use these violent tactics to overthrow it. Then you've got other people that are like, well, no, nonviolent resistance is actually a more powerful tactic, and we kind of go from there.
Yeah, and going back just a second to Kathleen's comment earlier, and then once you start understanding how far down, how it's violent turtles all the way down, right? Then it's easy just to be like, well, we're all complicit in this anyways. I might as well make nuclear warheads, or I might as well, I might as well, if other people are calling the police to protect their stuff, I might as well call the police to protect my stuff, even if there's a chance that this man might get killed by the police for just taking some stuff. It's just really hard when it's normalized how to disrupt it. And then the question is like, there's not only the tactics of whether or not it's righteous to kill someone, but there's the optics, like as a revolutionary tactic, there's also the optics of whether or not it turns people for or against your cause. And this gets really complicated real fast.
Yeah.
Got a comment here from, a couple comments. Kathleen, yeah. I have ongoing arguments with friends and family about spanking children. I think it teaches children that violence is an acceptable way to preserve order.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also that their behavior should be determined by obedience and fear of consequences rather than understanding the consequences of their actions naturally. So lots of.
Yeah, and right. I mean, there's no question about that, right? That in my mind, at least, that you are using violence, which creates pain, as a way of creating social boundaries, right? And that's this whole business of preserving society in a certain way. And so the people that are in favor of spanking children will tell you, well, no, that's not violence. I'll say, no, I'm not being violent. I'm teaching a lesson, right? I'm using this to help my kid figure out how to behave. And that really is this lack of awareness around how so much of our social order is created and preserved by violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Carson writes, I think an oft neglected piece in the violence discourse is animus. Buildings and statues and what have you lack a capacity of life, and therefore burning down buildings and ripping down statues are not violent acts. I would wager that they are forms of nonviolent resistance because it stops before the taking of animus of life. I tend to agree. I think the exception would be if you're destroying something as a perceived threat. So or if you're depriving somebody of something that's essential to their life. So to me, it's police officers tearing down tents in a park with all the possessions in it is more violent than if I walked over to a bank and burnt it down if no one was there. But we don't think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess I really kind of disagree with this. And I feel like it's a way of sort of trying to let people off the hook for doing certain things. I mean, to me, violence is really fundamentally about crossing and breaking boundaries. And so, if you say, all right, well, here's the accepted boundary of society, which is that, this statue gets to stay here in the park. And, I'm going to now come and throw ropes on it and pull it over. I mean, there is a certain violence to that. Now, we can talk about degrees of violence, or, is it worse to kill somebody than to tear a statue down? Yeah. But I think it's a problem if we just say that violence has to be about taking life. I think we get into a lot of trouble with that because there's all kinds of, verbal violence, emotional violence. There's, and certainly, if people end up feeling very scared or unsafe, if you burn a building that's somebody's business and, now they can't make a living and they starve. I mean, yeah. So I'm much more comfortable with saying all of that is a certain degree of violence. And now let's talk about that as a strategy and tactic.
Well, then it becomes a question about which violence is more helpful than other kinds of violence.
Yeah.
Because even the statue even being there is a type of violence.
Right. Exactly.
And so, like,
exactly.
I just want to spill it out because I don't think you're implying that somehow the status quo determines whether, like, if it's an established boundary. Well, we have established boundaries that are violent all the time.
Well,
but
right, and the statue being there, the statue being there is another type of boundary, right? So society has created this boundary by saying this is a good thing to display this. This is creating this mythology, and it's violated the boundary of the people whom that person has done violence towards in the past, and that's why I feel like, to me, the key issue is seeing the violence that is endemic all around us. Like, that has to be the starting point. And when we start parsing out, oh, the protester is violent and the happy person in the suburb is not, that's where we get into a real problem. And to me, no, it's like violence is endemic. Violence is endemic to the human activity. Let's start there. And now let's talk about if we really want a society without violence. And this is why this phrase, no justice, no peace, is, I feel like, a great way to look at this whole issue, is that if you have an unjust society that is full of violence, you are not going to get peace, because there are going to be always people that are going to react to the oppression and the violence that they're experiencing with violence at some point or another.
And I think it shows the complexity and the problem of a nonviolent / violent kind of binary. Now, and this is where a lot of it comes in. So, like, my tendency and tactic is to try to, because people assume the word violent is evil and nonviolent is good, I'll try to draw the line of violence where it starts harming humans or harming life in a way that is irreparable, right?
Mm-hmm.
You seem to be working at a more of a basic understanding of, like, it's like, well, if we go even further down, you could describe violence this way. And the whole reason why it becomes necessary for people to, like, say, well, if you just burn down a bank, it's not violence, is because this discourse is so dominated with nonviolence being good, that Jesus was nonviolent, that's anachronistic. Nonviolence is a relatively modern concept, at least the way we understand it today. And so we put it back on Jesus, and then we say, well, I want to be nonviolent, so I'm going to be against all violence, and I'm going to start with the violence that is obvious to me, which is that protester over there who's throwing a brick through a bank. Right. And I'll focus on that instead of really doing this deeper analysis, or even be able to get to the question of what are different kinds of violence? When is it appropriate and not appropriate? And what's the goal here? And so then you get all into these minute details, like where people are saying Jesus was violent because even though he said turn the other cheek, he used a whip on people, and so therefore we can drop a bomb in Hiroshima and not like it just there's this category leap, and once you've crossed into the category, then also now violence is okay, and that's a little bit of a simplification, but not by much. People just really shift their head into this, okay, violence is okay now. As long as the proper authority uses violence, it's okay.
Yeah. All right, let's roll. We got a few more comments. So it's quiet comment day today in transmission. Yeah. People resting from the intensity of yesterday, I guess. That's right.
Timothy writes, it occurs to me that one of the criticisms of the German people during the Nazi regime was that they helped the trains run on time. That is, a fascist state needs everyone being orderly and doing their job well. What if more Germans had committed job sabotage?
Mm-hmm.
I think there was examples of that sabotage happening. Was it in Denmark?
Yeah, Denmark was a big place. Yeah, I mean, there were some examples of that. But,
yeah. And so the question is, like, if you're just someone who, what level of awareness of the situation did you have to have in order to be complicit? Or could you be complicit in a system of death without even being aware of it? And then it comes with responsibilities. Like the willingness to look at that and say, I should recognize my responsibilities in this without being motivated by shame. That I should be relatively honest about how I benefit from violence and work to counteract that, even if I never punch someone.
Mm-hmm.
Leah writes, how do we help the suburbanite to see that they are themselves violent as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, that's one of the central questions. And it's, and one of the things that I just have been talking about more and more and more is that I think that we grossly underestimate the level of white denial in our society. And because if we break through that, we have to recognize the amount of pain that we have caused. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about, I don't know how many folks have watched this new show on HBO, Lovecraft Country.
Don't give any spoilers.
Yeah, I'm not going to give any spoilers, except to say that there are portrayals of very recent, the level of white violence in just a basic Midwestern town. If we really look at that, and open ourselves to that, it is so painful and so tragic, right? And these are people's parents and grandparents. These are not like 16th century, British slave traders. Right? These are people that we know. And it's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do.
Jim writes, are you saying we need to begin understanding by stepping back and looking at violence as a human condition?
Yes, I am saying that. I think that that's an important starting place.
I think that I would also add, like, if that's kind of the one hand of this conversation, the other hand is recognizing hierarchies of power.
Yes.
Right. So this idea of just treating each act of violence as the same is problematic, and even the act of killing is the same. And this whiteness tends to flatten everything around some sort of universal narrative, and in a way that cannot recognize the way certain people have more power than other people. And so George Floyd being murdered by a police officer is an act of violence that a lot of people didn't even understand as an act of violence. Still don't, and some people only recently understood that's an act of violence. That's even worse than if well, I don't want to get too revolutionary, but if someone someone kills someone who's oppressing them, which that's when we start usually noticing violence. So
yeah,
both those hands. Harper writes, hi Mark, I'm an anarchist and active anti-fascist. Do you report directly to Jason? That's the there's an Antifa meme about like someone spotting a duck at a protest and saying that, and then him being doxxed as the leader of Antifa. Anyways, it's related. It's adjacent to roll-up birds. I provide basic pistol safety workshops to vulnerable folks. Let's talk sometime. Right. That's a great example of one of those things that'd be contentious. That somehow that happening, a lot of people on the left that are committed to nonviolence get really upset at that, and oftentimes in ways that they wouldn't get upset about the police getting gun training.
Yeah, and and this is, and I mentioned this book, this Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, which is a great reflection on, basically Black people having to defend themselves in America. And as Mark, as you're talking about, there are not moral equivalents to these levels of violence. And yeah, if you're facing a society that is threatening to kill you constantly, and you decide, well, I need to get a gun and have a gun next to my door or wear a gun when I go out to defend my family, and this is not what I want, but I'm not just going to sit here and let everybody get shot up.
Mm-hmm.
That is nowhere near as, quote, violent as the violence of the state and what that is perpetrating against you. And I think that that's very, very important to be able to see that difference and understand that.
Leah writes, so we should see anti-violence like anti-racism. I think there's a correlation to be made. I wouldn't want to push that too far, but just like me being anti-racist means that there's a burden on people who have more power in our society to do the work. But everyone has to do the work. I mean, that's true. I think seeing anti-violence in terms of the greater power you have in society, the more responsible you are for your participation in violence.
Right. And that's what this professor does. He says, okay, let's start off, Don and John are two people that are equal. But then the one person that gets more and more power starts accumulating more and more and getting more and more power and wreaking more and more violence over the person that they're oppressing. And now whatever, quote, act of violence both Don and John do, they are not the same. And that's the really important thing to recognize.
Well, we're past time, so
we're past time.
Blaze through this, and the comments came a little later today, so it's your own fault.
Yeah.
Jeremy writes, I'm wrestling with...
But don't feel bad. We don't care.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Don't get upset and hit me for calling you out like that. I'm wrestling with the question of suffering as it relates to nonviolence. When we suffer instead of actively resisting through violence, when do we inflict violence to stop the suffering of others?
Yes. And that is a big part of it. And again, if violence is endemic, then suffering is endemic. And so, what are we willing to trade for more or less suffering? And that's the white denial thing. I mean, you have to realize if you're a white person in an all-white suburb having your all-white nice life in America, you are paying for that with the suffering of lots and lots of other people. And that's a really painful thing to come to grips with.
Yeah, there's a lot more in that we can say about that, but hopefully we'll circle back to this maybe sometime. Ray writes, a struggle. The dominant culture always gets to define violence. That's true. And all of our myths are built around ennobling some forms of violence and delegitimizing other forms of violence. So violence to the point of genocide and beyond committed to serve the dominant culture is not defined as violence at all. Brick through the window, all hell breaks loose. Yep. Kathleen writes, all of this law and order stuff is really about perpetuating violence against persons of color. That's right.
No.
Shalom writes, that white denial, it's the stuff of horror films for sure.
Yeah.
Catherine writes, every facet of most of our current lives depend on violence, from food and clothes to sanitation, much of which is made pretty or invisible unless you are the one being exploited. Or even when you are, I sound like a total paranoid conspiracy theorist trying to convince middle-class it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
And that's a great point, is that this violence is hidden by a sort of societal gaslighting. And you try to talk about it and people act like you're crazy. And you're not even talking about robot birds, which are real. And so
yeah. Gus writes, the episode of a podcast called More Perfect on the Second Amendment happens in two parts, and it's great looking at how the use of the Second Amendment has been used to protect the oppressed and status quo. Interesting. And then final comment from Catherine. And then when I convince people, they ask, what do we do about it? As though there's an easy fix. And then there's more bad news.
Right.
With that, what do we do about it? That's the big question. We'll end with that.
Yes. Well, and tomorrow, that's a perfect segue. Tomorrow we have 2 guests, and we're going to be talking about the Poor People's Campaign, which is a campaign to help do something about some of this stuff. So we're really excited. Julia and Viv will be with us, and please come and join us. And thanks for listening. Thanks for all the comments, and please talk to your local robot bird about whatever you're up to today.
Yes. See you.